Honourable Senators, I see a quorum. The Senate Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade is today meeting to examine the subject matter of Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code and other acts insofar as it relates to international obligations. Before I turn to the guests we have today presenting before us, I'm going to introduce the senators. I'm Rainelle Andrechuk from Saskatchewan Chair.
Steve Green from Nova Scotia.
Salma Dawlachan from Ontario.
Senator O from Ontario.
René Cormier du Nouveau-Brunswick.
Pat Bovey, Manitoba.
And appearing before us today are government officials from Global Affairs Canada, Mr. Mark Gwozdecki, Assistant Deputy Minister, International Security and Political Affairs, and Mr. Kevin Thompson, Director General, North America Strategy Bureau. We thank you for coming. We had asked for witnesses from Global Affairs Canada that could cover the agreements. Most notably, there are 3 conventions, but it affects many others. So we were hoping that we would get the varying officials from Global Affairs that could discuss the agreements in depth and the political consequences of the actions that the government has taken, as that is what we are empaneled to do. This is, in essence, a study, and we have until the end of the month of April to file our report, no later than May 1st, on the consequences of Bill 45 vis-a-vis international obligations, and that term is rather broad. And so we may have to hear from you, we may have to follow up, so that's sort of a forewarning. But I'm told that the 2 gentlemen here, as opposed to about 20 that I was expecting, can handle all questions. So I think we should test them after they do their presentation. So it is a broad field, and I think it's important to understand that the effects of Bill C-45 may go beyond those 3 international conventions, because there are children involved and our international obligations and how we approach them and how we might be violating any of these conventions by virtue of C-45, and how will the government handle that. So we have asked for the minister to come for any really political questions, but I think we'll start with you, and it's brave of you to come and start this whole process. We appreciate it. You are our first witnesses on this study. So I'm not sure if there are 2 separate or just 1. All right, so Mr. Gwozdecki, I will turn to you to make the presentation, and then you've been before us before, so you understand that we will put questions to you. So welcome to the committee, and the floor is yours on Canada's international obligations and how they may be affected by Bill C-45. Welcome.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Global Affairs Canada is responsible for coordinating Canada's overall international engagement to address the World Drug problem in partnership with all of the federal departments that have a mandate under the Canadian Drugs and Substances Strategy, including Health Canada, Justice Canada, Public Safety, and others. The international community has long recognized that addressing the consequences posed by international drug trafficking and problematic substance use is a shared responsibility. Global Affairs Canada's efforts are grounded in recognizing the fact that criminals do not respect national borders. Transnational organized crime groups and international drug traffickers pose serious threats to security, stability, and the rule of law. the substances they traffic can also pose serious risks to the health and the well-being of our citizens. The Government of Canada is committed to working with its international partners to combat international drug trafficking and mitigate the negative consequences that stem from problematic substance use.
To address the world drug problem is based on 3 UN drug conventions. They are the 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the 1998 UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. Together, these 3 conventions have as their ultimate goal protecting the health and welfare of humankind, and I'll return to that concept in addressing Canada's approach. In addition to the conventions, the international community regularly meets to discuss emerging trends and threats with respect to the world drug problem and prescribe measures states should take to respond. These discussions occur on a regular basis but are also subject to regular review every 5 to 10 years by the international community. The most recent global consensus on addressing the world drug problem was reached in April 2016 at the UN General Assembly Special Session on Addressing and Countering the World Drug Problem, also known as UNGAS. This meeting culminated in the UNGAS outcome document, which reaffirms the world drug problem as a complex and multifaceted challenge requiring a balanced and comprehensive response incorporating public health and human rights considerations. The UNGAS document also recognized that the world drug problem manifests itself differently across the globe, and that a one-size-fits-all approach is unrealistic, and that states need sufficient flexibility to adjust their policies according to national circumstances and priorities. Together, the drug conventions, the UNGAS outcome document, and other UN drug policy documents guide international cooperation on the world drug problem. Le gouvernement du Canada.
The Government of Canada is committed to implementing the UNGAS outcome document's operational recommendations, which are well aligned with the Canadian Drugs and Substances Strategy, including measures to support prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and enforcement, all grounded in a strong evidence base. Canada is also guided by the UNGAS outcome document in its international engagement with other states on the world drug problem. I will speak briefly to our ongoing efforts in this regard. Canada is a long-standing and valued member of the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Since the Commission was created in 1946, Canada has maintained its status as an elected member of the Commission for 66 out of the Commission's 72 years of existence. In April 2017, Canada was elected for another 4-year term. Canada is an engaged and committed member of the CND, and we regularly share information in this forum on new and emerging threats and experience in addressing the challenges that stem from problematic substance use. Canada is also deeply committed to capacity building to strengthen the international response to drug trafficking and problematic substance use. Global Affairs Canada is responsible for administering the Anti-Crime Capacity Building Program, which works to strengthen states' capacities to respond to the threat of drug trafficking, among other crimes. Currently, there is $16 million worth of operational programming under that capacity building program with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. There is an additional $2.7 million in project funding under development, primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean. While these projects are not solely focused on combating drug trafficking, they build the capacity of beneficiary states, which enables them to better manage and respond to drug trafficking and other security threats. Canada is also committed to regional cooperation. We regularly engage our partners in the hemisphere to share expertise, exchange experiences, and exchange information. We also build capacity through the Organization of American States Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission. Furthermore, we work trilaterally with the U.S. and Mexico to support discussions in the North American Drug Dialogue to combat threats to the continent, including those stemming from the ongoing opioid crisis. Through these regional forums, we have made tangible progress in establishing a shared understanding of threats in the hemisphere, and we have helped further joint initiatives to address drug trafficking and to strengthen our institutional responses to problematic substance use.
The efforts Global Affairs Canada undertakes to support international cooperation on the world drug problem, and Bill C-45 will not change that commitment. Canada will continue to cooperate with our partners to combat international drug trafficking and mitigate the harms of problematic substance use. Our partners appreciate Canada's contributions to the drug control framework. However, given that Canada will be the second country in the world to legalize cannabis at the national level, there is understandably interest from our partners. C-45 proposes a strict regulatory framework for the production, distribution, sale, and possession of cannabis, and strong penalties for those who break the law, with the aims of restricting youth access to cannabis and deterring criminal activity. These objectives are consistent with the overarching goal of the conventions and of our collective international efforts, and that goal is to protect the health and welfare of our citizens. As Minister Freeland acknowledged in early March 2017 during Senate question period, the government recognizes that Canada's proposed approach to cannabis will result in Canada being in contravention of certain obligations related to cannabis under the UN drug conventions. However, Canada will remain a strong supporter of the international drug control framework and is committed to working with treaty partners. Legalization of cannabis does not change this commitment. At this time, Canada does not intend to take any treaty actions. We will continue to work with our international partners to advance the objectives of the drug control framework. Through our international engagement, we've made clear that the reality in Canada is that, despite nearly a century of strict criminal prohibition supported by substantial law enforcement resources, cannabis use is widespread and relatively commonplace and is easily available across Canada. The failure of the current approach to adequately protect the health and safety of Canadians, especially youth, has resulted in Canada having among the highest rates of youth cannabis use in the world and has allowed criminals and organized crime to profit from its sale. In summary, through Bill C-45, the government is responding to the domestic public health and safety challenges through a strict regulatory approach in a manner consistent with the overall conventions of the overall objectives of the conventions, namely the protection of the health and welfare of our citizens. This is a domestic response to domestic challenges. The Government of Canada's goal for cannabis is to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth and to prevent organized crime from continuing to profit from the illegal cannabis market. The government does not advocate legalization as a solution for other countries and remains committed to the international drug control framework, including through the exchange of information and intelligence on drug threats, sharing expertise on problematic substance abuse, and supporting capacity building to strengthen the international response to the world drug problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Groth-Dickey. I'm going to ask a clarification point. You are saying that if Bill C-45 passes, you will take no action on the three major conventions that you talked about in asking for any reservation or change to the convention. So you will continue as is with the three conventions?
Yes. We are examining the experience of other countries and the reaction that our legislation will produce in our partners, and we will maintain an approach of looking for the best way to align our new posture with that of the conventions. There have been other countries, as I mentioned, at least one other that has gone as far as the Government of Canada intends to go, and that's Uruguay. And they took no action under the treaty and continue to operate in good standing inside the international drug control framework. Other countries with different approaches, I could go into in more detail. Some took different approaches, but there doesn't appear to be, as I mentioned, a one-size-fits-all approach to the situation that we face.
Okay, so again, are we violating any of the sections of the three major conventions by virtue of C-45? I think that's the question. It's a legal question. We signed on legally. Canadians live by conventions. They expect others to adhere to them. So we need to know whether there are any violations by virtue of C-45 and what possible actions we take. Uruguay has indicated that they are not going to be preoccupied with that, if I understand them. I don't want to misquote them, but that's what I've read in the press. That's not been Canada's. We want to be fully compliant with our conventions. So that's why the legal question.
We believe that Canada's approach is fully compliant with the overarching goals of these conventions, which is health and safety of our citizens. We will be in contravention of a subset of the provisions of the conventions that pertain to cannabis, but I should remind you that in at least one of the conventions, there are 124 substances that are to be controlled, and cannabis variations are a very small component of that. And of those other substances, many of them are very, very dangerous and need to be strictly controlled, more so than cannabis, of course. And we believe that we will remain fully compliant with all of those provisions and fully engaged in the partnership that we have in the international community to ensure that there's a proper regime around those more dangerous substances.
So, just so that I can get my members involved, could you, I presume you went through your legal department for the analysis, so you could perhaps provide us which sections that you've identified are not in compliance and state that you won't be taking further action, if I understand you, to be in compliance.
We can provide you with the portions of the conventions that are pertaining to cannabis, where we will be in a technical state of contravention. What I am trying to get at is that these conventions are much bigger than cannabis. They
No,
pertain to-
and
yes.
we appreciate that, but I think we need to know the facts and the consequences of
We
C-45.
can-
That's what we've been tasked to do.
Yes.
So I can't avoid it, whether it is, in your opinion, minor or major is not the issue. Does this bill affect the conventions? And as I understand from you, say, yes, they do. We're not going to get into what quality of that. So it would be helpful if we knew which ones you believe there is, as you use the term technical, we're not going to be in compliance, so that we're fully apprised, in a very accountable, transparent way, and we're going to have to report, because that was our task. So I would appreciate getting that. And I guess my follow-up question, in this analysis, you go to your legal department, and do you talk to Justice at all? Are they involved in the analysis of whether you're in compliance or not, particularly with C-45?
Yes, indeed. And beyond Justice, our partners in Health Canada and across Global Affairs, those who have an interest in this matter.
I have many more questions, but I'm going to certainly allow 6 questioners at this point. Senator Toulajan first.
Thank you, Chair. So my question to you is that on March 19th, the Senate Security and Defense Committee heard evidence on the issue of Canada-US borders, and some serious issues of concern were raised about the implications that Bill C-45 may have for Canadians crossing the border into the U.S. For example, potentially being banned from entering the U.S. for life, where there's an admission to using marijuana legally in Canada. So my question, therefore, is whether Global Affairs has undertaken any analysis on how C-45 may impact the movement of Canadians across the border once the bill comes into force.
Thank you very much, Senator. I'd be happy to answer your question. Canada and the United States cooperate very closely on border and security matters, and our respective border agencies, the Canada Border Security Agency and the Customs, the U.S. Customs Border Protection Agency, have very strong existing relationships. The legalization of cannabis will not change the nature of the cooperation between our border agencies. We remain very committed to working with the U.S. government to uphold the laws governing the cross-border movement in cannabis, to ensure that there continues to be a smooth flow or movement of people and goods at our shared border. I'll get to answering your specific question about prior use, but I do want to put some contextual facts on the table. One is that this is really an issue that is an issue involving both northbound and southbound traffic. Legalization of recreational use, adult recreational use in the U.S. Occurs in about 10 jurisdictions, so 9 states and the District of Columbia. 1 in 5 U.S. citizens now has access to legal cannabis for recreational purposes. Moreover, if you just look at the border states, about 4 of the 11 border states between Canada and the United States, with a possible vote in Michigan later this year, 4 of those states have legalized the use of recreational cannabis for adult use. 4 of the 11 border states. There are approximately 29 U.S. states that have legalized cannabis for medical marijuana purposes. So 10 of the 11 border states have either legalized marijuana for recreational use or for marijuana purposes. We are we are very much aware of some of the concerns that have been expressed about Canadians traveling to the United States and being asked about their prior cannabis use at the border, and that this has resulted in some instances in Canadians being rendered inadmissible to the United States. This is certainly one of the issues that we have raised and are raising with U.S. authorities through the various mechanisms that we've established to address this issue with the United States. And there are several mechanisms. One is a working group that's been established between the CBSA and the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. And a second is an ongoing dialogue that we have with the U.S. Embassy here that is a multi-departmental dialogue with the U.S. It's important that, that Canadians realize that for those who wish to enter the United States, they must adhere to the local laws when they're seeking entry. The fact is, Canada is proposing to change its law. The U.S. is not proposing to change its law. Under existing U.S. law, border agents have the ability to ask questions about prior use. We've been told by our CBP as well as other members of the administration that the U.S. does not intend to change its posture or its current practice in relation to these sorts of questions. But they do not intend to dramatically modify the type of practice that they currently have. I just want to put into context some of the concerns about inadmissibility. There were approximately 13 million Canadians who crossed at land borders last year in 2017. The number of Canadians who, according to CBP statistics, who were rendered inadmissible was about 6,800, or the number of processed, attempted entries into the U.S. It may have been multiple individuals, but of the 13 million trips into the United States, about 6,800 decisions of inadmissibility were made. That's approximately 0.05% of the traveling Canadian public. So we think it's important just to view this issue, which is a very real issue and a really an issue of concern for those Canadians who whose entry into the U.S. has been blocked because of these questions. But I think it's important to see it in its broader context.
Okay, go ahead. So you're saying 6,000 people. To me, 6,000 is a huge number. So then what would your advice to those Canadians be? Cross at one of the border states, one of the 4 border states that have legalized cannabis? So, I mean, is that what you're saying? What would you say to these people who would like to go to the States then?
Well, first
Should
of all,
we get a clarification that the border is a national issue in the U.S.? It's not a state responsibility.
That's true.
So as long as we get that straight on the record.
Right. Yes,
So
that's very
there would
true.
be no
So
exception.
entry into the United States is governed by the U.S. federal law. Right.
Exactly.
But I should just say the 6,800 figure in terms of inadmissibility covers all inadmissibility decisions, not inadmissibility decisions for cannabis use. So that includes previous criminal convictions for a range of different things, incomplete paperwork for going and working in the U.S. We're unable to get from CBP, from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, accurate statistics on the number of Canadians who have been deemed inadmissible for cannabis use. So we suspect that that's a very small percentage of the overall 6,000 figure.
But it's a small percentage now because it's not legal. What if it's legal in Canada? It might not be a small percentage. There might be more people willing to admit that they smoke cannabis.
Well, the way that we're dealing with this issue is we've got a fairly robust engagement with CBP. I do note that on Monday, the former CBP commissioner, during his testimony during the National Security and Defense Committee hearing, did say, and I quote, "In this day and age in our two countries, given the circumstances in our two countries, I would not see this as a particularly efficient use of very finite resources in Customs and Border Protection," and this being the systematic asking of all Canadians, have you smoked marijuana before? So CBP has indicated that its current practices there's no intention at this point to change its current practices. We continue to work very closely with the administration to underscore the objectives of this legislation. There are a number of states in the United States who have legalized marijuana ostensibly for the same purposes, protection of youth and reduction in organized crime. So we're very hopeful that as this process moves forward, we will continue to have very strong engagement with the U.S. and any problems that arise, we'll be able to deal with.
Okay. Senator Cormier.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Woznicki. In your words, you said, and in your answers as well, you said that there was, well, you talked about the three main UN conventions on drug control. So has the government found any other legal or political international engagements on which, or obligations on which C-45 could have an impact, particularly with regard to the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights or any other multilateral treaties? And if Bill C-45 did have an impact on those treaties, what kinds of corrective measures would the government take to correct those irregularities and to make sure that Canada respects its international obligations?
Thank you, Senator. Indeed, we have done the research, and we don't believe that there will be any negative impacts in terms of our compliance with these other conventions or legal arrangements. In fact, you mentioned the rights of the child. You know, the purpose of the Canadian legislation is to better protect our children and our youth. And so we feel like this legislation will actually be supportive of our commitment to protecting the rights of our children. But as I say, we're not aware of any other negative impacts that this legislation might have on our other international obligations.
Merci. Yes.
Okay, Senator O.
Yeah, I have a question that just follow up. Thank you, Chair. Follow up from your question. Does the federal government intend to formally withdraw from the United Nations Drug Control Conventions, or is the federal government planning to violate our international obligation when Bill C-45 is adopted?
Thank you, Senator. Withdrawing from the drug conventions, which regulate the movement of a vast range of drugs and substances. I mentioned that there was at least 124, of which cannabis products are a very small subset, and many of these for medical and scientific use. Withdrawing from that framework would be an excessive response and an unnecessary response, and would also be detrimental to both Canada and the international community's interests. Legalization of cannabis does not change our commitment to meeting the goals of the International Drug Control Framework, protecting the health and safety of citizens, and nor does it change our approach to working internationally to ensure that there is a proper drug control ecosystem out there. I should also add that we are in constant discussion with our partners internationally, and many of them do not wish for Canada to withdraw from these arrangements. They value the contributions that Canada brings. They wish for Canada to remain a party, because of our contributions and the role that we play. And so we're looking at all of the options available to us, but we believe that withdrawal would be an excessive, unnecessary, and detrimental step.
In your opening remarks, you say that the U.S. border crossing they are not changing anything to adopt Canadian adoption of Bill C-45, correct? For border crossing.
Yes, in the discussions that we've had so far with the Americans, the U.S. has given us no indication that they are going to change current practice. They do have, under their existing law, the discretion to ask questions about prior use. They do have a range of discretion to ask about whether people are in possession of cannabis. They've indicated to us that their existing practice will not change.
So do you foresee a large number search that are going to be Canadian are not allowed to enter the U.S.? Because if they ask you whether do you use marijuana or cannabis for the past 21 days?
We don't foresee that there's going to be a major surge. Like I say, the CBP have that power now, and they, as the numbers show, they do not ask on a systematic basis whether Canadians have smoked marijuana. I'm sure there are instances where individuals try to cross into the United States, and there may be some suggestion that they are in possession of cannabis, so a CBP officer will ask questions to try to elicit that sort of response. But at this point, that's a law enforcement issue where they're trying to prevent cross-border trafficking in cannabis, and they will continue to use their discretion in a way that helps to reduce the number of instances of cross-border trafficking.
I don't get it. Why not? You just mentioned earlier that we are the #2 country in the world, young people using cannabis. So the crossing into the U.S., the number would surge. Why not? The number will stay the same.
Well, so currently we're the #1 users or we have very high usage rates amongst our youth, and the number of inadmissible Canadians is a very, very small percentage of those that travel to the United States. So we don't have reason to believe that will increase significantly in the event that this legislation is passed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Bovey.